I want to go over some things about jQuery and Bootstrap a little bit more. I kind of threw you into the water, and you were learning this stuff with Free Code Camp and trying to apply it to your glitch page, but there was a very common error or bug that was happening with Free Code Camp, and that you would try to copy and paste this stuff and put it in your own file, and it wasn't working quite right. And it wasn't working at all, really. So I want to show you what's happening. When I reload the page, you should see some animation over here. Okay, you see it bouncing and going up and down, shaking, that sort of thing. And some folks were like, well, I want my thing to do that. What's happening here with this Free Code Camp lesson is that they're just teaching you that jQuery can add CSS classes to things. So they're adding the CSS class of animated, they're adding the CSS class of bounce, but they do you a disservice here in that they don't actually show those classes. They're actually pretty complex classes. CSS animations can be complex. So they're like, well, we don't want to clutter all this up with all that CSS, but at the same time, it's kind of deceiving because you think you can just put this stuff in and it'll work. It won't work. You'll need to build these classes, whatever these classes are, and then it will work. Now, this will work if you have Bootstrap installed. This is a btn-default. That's a Bootstrap class. And so that's the big concept about Bootstrap and jQuery that I want to go over, is that Bootstrap and jQuery provide you with a bunch of stuff that works. And so Bootstrap in particular, let's look at getbootstrap.com. They'll provide you with classes that you can just use right now. Like you can use this class of border bottom if you have Bootstrap installed, and suddenly you can put a bottom border on something. You could give it a border, and then you could color it border primary. So they give you all these. These are what's called utility classes. But looking at something like their button, they can let you style the button in this way using these simple classes. You don't have to do anything else. You don't have to create these classes. When you install Bootstrap, these come in. That's why I say it was kind of tricky and they were doing a disservice, because you might have thought that these classes were installed with something, but they're not. The animated and bounce and shake and fade out, those aren't any classes that are included with Bootstrap or jQuery. btn default is. And so that's kind of a mistake in this. And actually, I'm going to submit this is open source, this class. So I'm going to submit a pull request in which we use Bootstrap classes or something that does exist for users instead of these things. Or we include the CSS with these things. So just to make it more explanatory. I want to talk about this component that we're going to ask you to build. This is a contact me component, and it looks more complicated than it is. It's really just some copying, pasting, some Bootstrap stuff. I'll show you, I'll go by this line by line of this component and try to explain what Bootstrap's doing and then what jQuery's doing. And hopefully at the end of this video, you have a more in-depth understanding of the two things. So again, Bootstrap is just giving us some classes to play around with. And over time, you're going to find out what the Bootstrap classes are. Like I said, there's utility classes. If you're let's see, margin, utilities for layout, margin, and padding. I use these one all the time. Spacing utilities. Here we go. So a wide range of shorthand, responsive, margin, and padding utility classes. That sounds more complicated than it is. But basically, you can say M is margin, T is top. So you can have this MT0, MT1, and that's what Bootstrap has set as being their spacers. You know how we used in CSS variables, we did this thing where we had sizes. Well, Bootstrap has the same thing going on in the background. And so what I have here in this very first thing, I have my application with a margin top of 4. And that's just a number. It doesn't mean 4 pixels or 400 pixels. It's just the Bootstrap predetermined size. So I could change this to 1, for example, and you'll see that margin gets reduced up top there. I put it at 4 simply because I like that. you have a lot of freedom to mess around with it. Now remember, it goes container, row, column with Bootstrap, and so container just contains most of your body stuff. If you do a header or a footer, you would keep that outside of the container if you wanted the header or footer to go all the way across. But your body text, and for this example, we're going to keep everything in the container, and then a row. So we've got everything in a row. There is one more thing with Bootstrap that you'll see me do, and that is when something hits 12 columns, it'll automatically push it to the next row. So, because you can't have a Bootstrap is a 12 column grid, and so you cannot have something that exceeds 12 columns. So if something exceeds 12 columns, it goes to the next row. And so throughout this, I have a row. It ends right here. This whole thing is one row technically, and I just have column 12 pushing things to the next column, and so that it reads well vertically. You can break everything out into its own rows, and it's probably actually better to do that, especially as you're learning. But it's a Bootstrap feature in that you don't have to put everything in its own row if you have things going at the full 12 column. So example, if I had something here at column 6 and another column 6, and then I had something else with a third column 6, that third column 6, that crosses the 12 columns that are allowed and would go to the next row. That's how you see something like Pinterest, where you have lots of boxes. Pinterest, I don't know, Pinterest.com. I've never been on Pinterest. I mean, I don't know. I don't know, but I know it's famous for what's called the masonry, this kind of masonry layout. Oh, mercy. Oh, it does know me. It knows me from back in the day. So basically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's allowing 7 things to go across the top here, and then one would push down to the next. That's kind of how you have to think about Bootstrap columns, is that there's 12 spaces for columns, and if you exceed that, it's just going to push it down to the next thing. So I'm using these are all Bootstrap things. Everything here is Bootstrap. I'm using Bootstrap 4 for this example. And I'd like you to install and mess around with Bootstrap 4. If you're curious about the documentation, you could just start digging around. You see I'm in the Bootstrap 4.4 docs. You change that in the upper right-hand corner here. But this is their container system is a little different than Bootstrap 3. It's a little nicer. So the way you get their smallest container, instead of saying column XS 12, you actually just say column 12. That's the difference. That's probably the most significant difference between Bootstrap 3 and 4, is that they view the XS, the extra small, as being the default setting. So, they're just saying you don't have to type that anymore. You can just say column-12. So that's all I'm doing. These are Bootstrap classes. H3, you know what that is. There's a contact me. Going down, I've got, you're like, oh, wow, I've got custom control, custom radio. What is all this? Well, what I did is I just went to forms, inside of their forms, Bootstrap checkboxes and radios, and you can see it right here. But I didn't want my radio buttons to look like these default radio buttons. I wanted them to look like nice. So as you can see, I have them look a little nicer. I'll show you how that is. I go down here to custom forms and radios, and you can see that Bootstrap has made some custom ones that work really well. And literally all I did, I just copied this, went into my thing, and just pasted it. And you can see there it is. That's working. And then what I did after that, I changed. So Bootstrap includes these, again, they include these. I'll nice that up a little bit. Bootstrap includes these classes, because you just copied and pasted them from Bootstrap. So, but the ID and the name, you can change those things. You can change the name and ID to be things that make make sense with your application. And obviously you can change the text in between. Toggle this custom radio, blah. So that's all I did here. Is if you look, I have the same thing. I just copied and pasted, but then I changed the ID to contact me, this is a professional request, this is a personal request, so I say professional reason. The name of this radio, remember radios have to share the same name, is reason for inquiry. So reason for inquiry is shared between the two radio buttons, and then the ID is unique to each of them. So the first ID is professional reason, the second ID is personal reason. So you can see that I can just copy and paste the Bootstrap stuff, and that's encouraged because Bootstrap, like I said, it's an open source community. Something like 1,100 developers have worked on it. Oops, I went too far. And because of that, they've created all this stuff that you can just use. So that's what I did with these radio buttons. And again, you would find that by just going into forms inside of Bootstrap. This is radio buttons and checkboxes are considered part of forms in Bootstrap. And along the side here, I found what I was looking for, which was custom forms, checkboxes, and radios. That's what I wanted. And I see they give you an example here that works, and you can just copy and paste this, change the ID, change the name. Remember, the name has to match between these two things, but these IDs have to be unique between these two things. You can see radio 1 and radio 2. Those are unique, but this is the same. And that's it. And of course, you change the text in here. One thing you'll notice is that they have this, the way Bootstrap lays it out is they put the label after the input. We learned that you could wrap the input with the label and then put the text around it. But with Bootstrap, they don't want you to do that. And I think it's better. It's actually a better practice to do it the way they're doing it, which is an input, which is very explicit that this little thing is the input, and then a label. Now, the difference when you do it that way, though, is you have to include this attribute called for. So for, and then what's this? Well, this is the ID. So the label for this ID, that's how it reads. So that's the gotcha. But again, if you copy and paste and then change the ID and make it match, it'll all work for you. So I'll go through the HTML stuff first, and then I'll go through the jQuery. You might have already noticed that when I clicked on this, the button changed, and that's part of the jQuery that we're going to be talking about. It's not part of the HTML. So next, we went through the H3. We've got the radio buttons. Next, we have a text area. This is a text area. You can look it up on MDN. So I would just say text area MDN, and they'll give you all of the properties. I wanted my text area to look big. So one of the attributes it has, sometimes I call them properties. I just call them properties, but they're really called attributes. One of the attributes is rows, and if I change this to something like, say, 8, this will look bigger. I wanted it, it's just whatever I wanted it to look like. That's your job to style it how you want. I gave it this MT, remember that's a Bootstrap class, margin top 2. So basically I'm saying give it a little bit of margin up there, although I see a bug. I mean, not really a bug, but a bad practice. I would just include it in the div. There you go. So I've included it in the div instead. So here's the surrounding div is where I put those margins instead of within that div. Not a big deal. It's just a good practice. And then I've given this text area its own unique ID of email body, because remember, we want them, when you click on this, if you've seen a contact form before, you know that I type in something here, and then I am able to send it to someone. Refresh the page because I didn't mean to type in there. I mean, I did, but it does some jQuery stuff. Glitch lately has been slow in the afternoons, which has kind of been a bummer for everyone all around. So much so I was like, should I even use Glitch anymore? There's other things out there. There are other things out there, but it is so cool when it works. Next, I want to talk about, so we talked about the text area. That's really all it takes for the text area. You give it an ID, and how big do you want it with rows, and maybe some padding, some margins up top. And you can see that I put the column of 12, and the next one is also in a column of 12. So that's what makes it kick down to a new row, is the fact that you can just keep doing things that fill up column 12. I could do, for example, just to prove my point that I said earlier, I could do 2 text areas and then give them a column of 6. And see how that would kick side by side? Now watch. I'm going to give one more with a column of 6, and it's going to go just down there like that. Okay, so that's hopefully a good example explaining what goes on with the Bootstrap columns. And again, I'll put this back to 12 to fill up that thing like I wanted it. Next, we have a checkbox. Well, again, I didn't want the default checkbox. I wanted one that looks good. And again, that's found right here in custom checkbox. Great. And where did that go? Right here, div. So basically it just looks like this. There it is. I copied and pasted it, and what did I change in mine? Well, I had to leave the classes. I gave it its own ID called Are You Human? That's my little robot checker button. And then the label, remember, goes after it, and it also has to be tied in, for that ID. And that's it. It doesn't need a name. It doesn't need, because radio boxes need a name to tie these two things together. But the checkbox is all on its own, and it doesn't need anything beyond what I've just given it. So you will notice that I did give it this class of isInvalid. And you're like, well, where is that? I can't quite remember where it is, but I'll show you. Search. No, I don't want to search radios. Validation. And then, okay. So yeah, validation is what this is called. And I just knew that Bootstrap had this after using it. That's the kind of thing is when you get into a framework and you're working at a job, they start using the tools that are available to them. And okay, so it says isInvalid and isValid classes may be used instead of the all you need to know really is that they've created these classes called isInvalid and isValid, which style this checkbox in a certain way, and it also works for other form elements like text area and these buttons. So here I'll just change this to isValid, and you can see that it's green. Okay, the default setting is nothing. It's just like your standard checkbox, but we want to style this with isInvalid just because this is the exercise we're doing with jQuery. And then finally I have a button, and I see that my margin diminished a little, so I'm going to do margin top 4. There, add a little more. That's too much. Margin top 2. And again, you're just deciding what these margins are. And this is just a button. These are Bootstrap classes, button primary, and then float right. And you're like, what is float right? You wouldn't know these things until someone came along and helped you out and told you, or you went through all the documents. But I'm telling you right now. And so you don't have to feel like I didn't know that float right existed. Of course you didn't know that float right existed. You know now. I'm showing you the most important things with Bootstrap and jQuery. There are hundreds and thousands of classes and jQuery selectors and stuff like that you can go through on your own time, but I'm going to show you the most important ones so you can build something that looks like this, and this looks professional, and people will be impressed by it, and you'll solve people's problems. Ultimately, that's the real goal, making a web page that solves people's problems. Like I said, this is all the jQuery stuff that you could learn if you wanted. Click on every single one of these, scroll down here, and keep going. But I'm going to show you the most important things. So you didn't know that float existed? That's okay. Now we're saying float. That's a class. That's a Bootstrap class. That'll just push something to the right. It's like the CSS float property. CSS float MDN, if you hadn't messed with it yet. It basically does the same thing, left or right. But Bootstrap gave you something where you don't have to do this with CSS. You can just add it here as a class, and it just works. I gave this button the ID of email button. But then I gave it something unique to buttons, which is an attribute called disabled. So let's look at that. Button MDM. And if you look at button, all these attributes, you can see that disabled exists. And so what's interesting, the style, what happens with the style with Bootstrap is that when you don't have something disabled, this is what a regular button looks like. But when it is disabled, it's a little lighter shade. And you'll notice when you hover over it, you get this little do not symbol. I actually added that because I wanted it to be very explicit that you could not click on that. So this is one of the very few styles I added. But I added cursor not allowed. You're like, I didn't know you could do cursor not allowed. Again, it's one of those things where it's like you just start looking these things up and seeing what you can do. You can do crosshairs, crazy. A little weight hourglass. Oh no, that's not the hourglass. It's the little spinner. I believe it used to be an hourglass. Interesting. Help question marks. But we're using cursor not allowed. And you weren't expected to know that, but I'm just showing you that it exists and you can do it. I will say that above it, this text area, the default width of text area is something weird and marginal. Like it's just this arbitrary width that doesn't matter. So I gave it the width of 100% to better fit the screen. And so what I did with this, this hovering or this button disabled cursor, I also gave a style of cursor pointer to these checkboxes and the radio buttons, because the default with Bootstrap is that those aren't checked and there's just this little arrow. And frankly, from my perspective, I've worked with users long enough where when they use something on a computer, they do hover over it, and if it has a little pointer icon, they feel better, like they can click it. Here, people are more reluctant to click. They don't know that they can click. So I added cursor pointer. That's it. That's it for my CSS styles. Everything else has been included with Bootstrap. So the way that this looks, if you think, wow, this looks really clean and professional, that's just Bootstrap. And that's why I have you moving to it as quick as possible so we can start getting to some fun stuff. So that's everything on this page. And let's talk about, and we already went through the CSS. Now let's talk about the JavaScript. This is your jQuery. And it's going to look like a lot at first, I admit. But we're going to talk about what each thing is. This first thing is you should recognize this pattern. When you have the $sign, the parentheses, and then a string in between it, that's a selector. When you always start with a selector. You always have to select an element. And then you can do a method. And so we've gotten this selector, but it's in between these quotation marks is called a string. And what we're doing is we're selecting an ID every time. So when we click on personal reason, we're going to execute some function. Click, personal reason, function. But why am I using an ID? And if you remember what I did in this example from yesterday, this morning actually, but I made it yesterday, I used classes instead. And the reason I used classes, actually I didn't have to use classes. Oh no, the reason I used classes, for some of these they could have been IDs, but I used classes because when you're using them in multiple, classes can be used in multiple spots, whereas IDs have to be unique on your page. They can only be used once. So here you see I've got title 1 multiple times. That's why I use classes, because I used it more than once. So I wanted it so that you could click on the arrow or click on the name and get the same functionality. So I used the same class between these two. And then in my jQuery, I made it title 1. So title 1 is found on you can see this H2. It's found on the H2. And title 1 is also found on this image, this SVG icon. So that's why we had to use classes there. Now, we don't have to use classes here because every single thing is individual. If I click on personal reason, I gave this one an ID. This radio button has its own ID. I'll scroll up here so you can see it. This is a personal request. It has an ID of personal reason. So what's going to happen is when we click on this particular ID, the email button, so we have another selector here with the ID of email button. Let's look at our thing, look at our HTML, and we can see that this is a button. There it has the ID of email button. Okay, so we've got a jQuery selector saying when you click on this HTML element, let's select another HTML element and do something to it, and that's what we call the method after it. And the method is HTML, and you're like, gosh, what is HTML? Well, let's look for, I guess that's why they put a search bar, huh? There it is, HTML method. And this is get the HTML elements of the first element. That's a little complicated. It's basically get, if you don't give it any, if you don't give it anything, give it any what's called an argument. If you don't give it any, if you don't give it any arguments right here, if this was just blank, it would just get whatever that element was. But we're actually giving it a string, and what that's doing is going to change the HTML. And so that's what, that's what we're talking about. So here we are, HTML, and then this is just some string that we're going to change the HTML to. That's what they're saying in their documentation here. Again, you wouldn't know that. That's why I'm here. I'm here to show you. So HTML is something useful you can do. You can change the HTML on your page. Interesting. So the point is, when you click personal request, we want this button. Remember, that's the HTML of this ID. It's not the HTML just anywhere on the page. It's only of that ID. So email button, when we click on it, it's going to say email personal request. There it is. It says email personal request, and it says email personal request there. So all I did is I copied and pasted that, and then I changed the ID to be this professional reason, this ID of professional reason, which again, let's look at the HTML. Professional reason right here, this input, this top one, this is a professional request. When I click on that, we're going to see that the HTML of the same button, email button, gets changed to email professional request. Now, I know that that's not very useful just to change the button. It's not changing the type of message that's sent to someone or anything complicated like that. It's very simple, but I want the concept that you can change HTML elements by clicking on other HTML elements. That's what we're illustrating with these two things going back and forth like that. Let's talk about this email body because it has a different event, which I think is interesting. So we have the jQuery selector here for something with the ID of email body. Well, what was that? Well, that was our text area. Our text area right here, all we did was we declared the rows and gave an ID of email body. That's all we had to do. And then we can use it in our jQuery. So we can select email body and we can say when, instead of a click, but when there's a key press, then what do? Well, we find the email button ID. So the button itself has an ID of email button. And then we're going to remove that attribute of disabled. So remove attribute is something that you can learn in jQuery cheat sheet. Here. There's lots of things. Remove property, remove attribute. You can actually remove entire things from your web page. You can take out whole sections. You can have buttons that add and remove sections, and you can append sections. And so you could have a button that just adds something new underneath it and adds something new underneath it and add, this is where we're starting to build basic web functionality. But for this example, all we're doing is removing the attribute of disabled. Remember that when I went to the button itself and I removed the attribute of disabled, well, it turned into a regular button that I could click on and it was darker blue. So I'll give it that attribute of disabled now. And now remember, what we want is when we're in this email body, once you press a single key, it's going to let you, it's going to make that no longer disabled and therefore let someone click on it. So I'm going to press a key, F, and you can see that now I can click on this button. Great. That's all this function is doing. So that if you didn't, if you never clicked in anything, you would get that disabled thing. We're just illustrating how you can use a different type of event. This is a key press event, and how you can remove an attribute from something. That's what we're illustrating with that. Next, we have this "Are you human?" ID, which is this checkbox. Here it's everything that we copied and pasted from Bootstrap. So let's do this, show that it's all there. And we gave the input an ID of "Are you human?" And we have the label for that ID, "Are you human?" which has this text, "Check to prove you are not a robot." Okay, so when you click that, we are going to, again, select that same ID. We have to be very explicit. You can select that same ID, and we're going to remove that class is invalid. Remember what happened when I removed that class is invalid. It just looks like a normal checkbox, right? Okay, let's put it back. And now we're looking at this code. When I click this ID, or the label for it, it encompasses everything there. So I'm going to click that, and it should remove the class. There it goes. It removed the class, and it's checked. So that's all we're illustrating with this concept is that you can remove classes. You know that you can add classes from this, add and remove classes from this free code camp lesson. But these classes are either, they must be included with Bootstrap, which is what this is, or classes that you've made yourself. Like I said, free code camp kind of does you a disservice in that you think that these animated bounce and shake and stuff are included somewhere. They're not. So I'm telling you what classes are included and how you can use them. So isInvalid is one of those classes, and we can remove it by just clicking there. Let's finally move to this email button. It's a little more complicated. The email button itself, this is a button with the ID of email button. And I'll go ahead and press a key press to make it enabled. But email button, when we click this button, now we're going to execute some JavaScript. And you don't know this, and that's okay. I'm teaching it. One thing JavaScript allows you to do is open a new window for someone. So all you do is you just type this command, window.open, and then some parentheses. And within those parentheses, we are going to give it a string. And this is your email address, or if you don't want to use your email address, you can use my email address. So we're doing a mail to, and you're like, what is a mail to? I think we might have gone over that. If we haven't, mail to MDM, it's under creating hyperlinks, but you can go Control F mail to just because I'm lazy and going to find it. Email links is what they call it. So you create a link to send an outgoing email message, to open someone's email client and send an email message. I use Gmail, so when I click on this, it's going to open Gmail for me. Okay? You can see that there it goes. And it's going to have, so that's what this first little part of it means. Mail to .mike@mikezetlow.com, question mark. Subject equals hello. That's all it is. That's the subject. The ampersand is a special character. So when you look up the mail to documents, you can see that you can do subject, you can do BCC, you can do body. You can add a bunch of parameters here. if you'd like. We're just going to do subject and body, and so we're just making the subject hello. We're just hard coding that right here. That's what we call it. But the body, we want to get the body from this input. And so with JavaScript, one thing you can do is you can take one string, which is denoted by these quotation marks, and you can add it to another string. And you're like, well, how do I find out the string of what these characters are inside here, right? So if this is like someone sending me a message saying, hi, Mike, you're like, well, how do I find out what that is? Well, you use the jQuery selector and .val and then 2 parentheses. And that gets the value of whatever element you've included in your jQuery selector. Remember, email body is for our text area right here. So we're going to get the value and we're just going to append it to this string right here. That's what this plus sign does with strings in JavaScript. The fancy word is concatenate. And when we go through the punch code coding curriculum, the 12-week course that we have, I teach concatenate and other things like that in a fun way. But for the purposes of this, it's okay that you understand, okay, I've got this string, and here's how I got the text that was in there. Next, you want to include you want to include a comma after all this, and then underscore blank. And that's just part of the mail to, you might Google this, like window open. So sorry, I'll do this like you would do this. So you would say open a new tab, mail to, and then you would do JavaScript. And you would probably just grab the first thing. And you can see that, look, people are using window open. Or there's another method you could use, location.href. But here, the second argument, is that what the person wants you to do, to window open? So that's how you would find, the answers. They want underscore self in that example, but I don't think this is the right thing. Open a new tab, mail to JavaScript. So let's find something else. So here's what you're used to with an anchor inside of HTML. I don't know why this is so hard for people to answer. Sometimes you do really got to dig around. And I'm just going to tell you the right answer right now because that's what matters. You would find it eventually searching through all this stuff, but the right answer is to include a second thing here. So you've got this first string. This is technically all one string because you're concatenating them with this plus sign. So you're basically saying one big thing. Mail to mike@mikezatlow.com, subject hello, and body equals hi Mike. That's because that's where we get the value. That's all one thing inside of quotation marks as far as JavaScript is concerned. And then the second thing, you separate that with a comma. The second thing you send it is this parameter of underscore blank, and that'll open it in another window. So now you see, I'll show you right now. When we click on this, we're going to be directed to mail to my email address with the subject line of hello and the body of hi Mike. Okay, there it is. And then I'll just do this, trying again. So now I'll fire it again, see what happens. It should say trying again. There it is. And that's what it takes. If your email client does not open automatically when you go through this process, you send me a message or Google it because there is some shenanigans that happens where sometimes it doesn't open an email client for you, depending on what your browser is set. I recommend developers use Chrome and a lot of the defaults that Chrome has, and so that'll open it knows that I have Gmail, and it'll open actually Chrome, the first time that you do this, if you never have done this, clicked on a mail to link before, Chrome will ask you how you would like to handle these links. That's all browser setup stuff that you should have set up already. I mean, just over the years of using a browser, it'll already be set up. If it doesn't work out, send me a message. The point of this exercise is to say that you can click on a button and have it trigger some JavaScript. And the JavaScript, the first piece of JavaScript, the real first piece of JavaScript that you've learned is window open. So that's a lot to go over in this video, and hopefully I've illustrated what Bootstrap and jQuery are doing for you. Bootstrap in particular is giving you a set of classes that you can use so you can get professional looking stuff up quickly. And jQuery is giving you these selectors, these events, and then the methods. If you want to change the HTML, remove an attribute, remove a class, that's what jQuery is getting you. And finally, you learned your first one piece of JavaScript right there, which is window open. So that's a lot. I'm not expecting you to know these things. I'm expecting you to be interested in these things after seeing me work with them, and then explore the documentation on your own and start to incorporate them in your own glitch page. Good luck.